I don't know about you, but I'm really terrible with directions. Maybe it's the fact that I never joined Boy Scouts. Directions were always my Achilles heel. My dad would actually tell you that. I was never good with cardinal directions, like where something is. I had to go by landmarks. That was just the way my life was set up. Now, over the years, I have learned a few tricks. The easiest one, which I've known for years, which you probably know, is this. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Wherever the sun is, it's really easy to figure out which direction is north, which direction is south, and east and west from the sun. Another one that I started to learn was there's a tendency for moss to grow on the north side of trees. So that was also an easy way of figuring out which direction is which. Another one that I remember hearing was odd number highways run north and south, and even number highways run east to west. Now, there's a pretty awesome tool to use in these scenarios. It's a compass. No matter where you are on the earth, a compass will always point north. Unless it's broken, of course, or unless it's Jack Sparrow's compass for Pirates of the Caribbean. Some of you will get that, some of you won't. But if you don't have a compass that pointed north, then it would be broken, thereby making you lost and hopefully not stranded in the middle of nowhere. Okay? Now, in our lesson this morning, we are going to discuss directions, just in a different fashion. See, a compass points us in the direction that we want to go, just in the same fashion that God points us in the direction that He has called us to go and calls us to point others in the right direction as well. So, we started back in January going through the big picture story of the Bible. It's called The Thread. That's the curriculum we've been going through. It's called The Thread. And last week, we started transitioning from talking about the story of the Bible into talking about specific epistles that were written by apostles. Now, we talked about last week how an epistle is a letter that was written to a specific people for a specific purpose as they are in specific circumstances. Now, we're going to be in 1 Peter today, specifically 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 12. So if you want to go ahead and turn there, that's where we're going to be at. But see, 1 Peter is a letter or an epistle written by Peter, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. This was written to several churches scattered across Asia Minor. Now, the last time we saw Peter, he was leading the early church. Now, approximately 30 years later, he is writing to churches that have formed in Asia Minor to encourage them in the face of suffering and persecution. So that's what's going on. Now, if you remember our lesson last month about Stephen, you'll remember some of the context around this letter here in 1 Peter. See, after Stephen was martyred in Acts chapter 7, the believers in Jerusalem fled due to persecution and suffering, and they settled in different places. And after they relocated, the believers established churches in their new towns and shared the gospel with many different people and the residents of those towns, who would then also become believers also. So at the time that Peter is writing this letter, the churches in Asia Minor are mostly made up of Gentile believers, which just means they come from a pagan background, not a Jewish one. And they were living under oppressive rule of the Roman Empire and facing discrimination in their towns. So that's what was going on. There was a lot of persecution happening, and Peter is writing this letter to encourage them in the face of this persecution. Now, this letter was probably written in the 60s AD, a little bit before Peter actually dies. All right, and so I want you to go ahead and read this passage and answer these questions, and we'll come back together. Okay, so right here in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 8, Peter makes two distinct references to living stones. Now, who is he talking about here in verse 4? Because that's the first part where we're talking about a living stone. And here in verse 4, he is referring to Jesus, somebody who was rejected by men, but chosen by God. That's the reference he's making here. And we have to really think about this for a minute. In your shoes, I asked this question, and hopefully you were able to talk about it with somebody next to you, or you were, thinking about it on your own terms. But in your own opinion, which is better? Would you rather be chosen by men but rejected by God, or chosen by God but rejected by men? And if we really think about that, if you're not a Christian, okay, many people who don't follow Christ would probably rather be rejected by God than men, right? I mean, the thought of being rejected by humanity can be very difficult to deal for a lot of people. In fact, even as a Christian, it's difficult to be rejected by a friend, to be rejected by a girlfriend or boyfriend, to be rejected by just anybody in our society to be rejected. We don't like to be rejected because we don't feel accepted. We as human beings care about being loved, accepted, belonging somewhere. And to be rejected by men can be a very difficult thing in a lot of ways. But hopefully you would think as a Christian, hey, I would rather be rejected by men than by God, because God's our creator, right? I would rather understand that God created me and he desires me to live for him, and he chose me. And if I'm rejected by men, that's okay. In a later life, when we die and we're with our Father in heaven, there's something greater for us. I would rather be rejected by men and chosen by God than the other way around. And I hope you would feel the same way, because that's the only way we're going to have any purpose or meaning in life at all. We then have to understand what Jesus as a living stone means, because that helps us understand what Jesus is talking about. You see, Jesus is in fact alive, living. Okay, Jesus is a living stone. So this is a reference to Jesus' resurrection. All right, but we also have to understand this idea of a cornerstone. Now, we see later on here, as we're about to find out, Jesus being called a cornerstone. Now, if you don't know what a cornerstone is a stone specifically laid for the foundation of where the place is where two walls come together. And it's crucial for the stability of an entire building. Without it, the building will come crashing down. It keeps the building stable. So Jesus, being a living stone, being a cornerstone, is the foundation of the church. Without him, the church doesn't stand. Now, amazingly, God uses Jesus, who is not accepted by the religious leaders of the time, who is rejected by men, to be the key piece, the key foundation for his people. So it's kind of it's a reference to that. You could see the symbolism in this idea of Jesus being the foundation, being the cornerstone. Okay, so in verse 5, we then see living stones is referred to again by Peter, and there it refers to the people of God, the church. So living stones, according to Peter, refers both to Jesus and his people. So here's the point. The church is a people, not a building. God is building a church made up of his people with Jesus as the foundation of the church. And everything should be built on him, which means that the church should accurately reflect who Jesus is and what he is like. In other words, the church should be pointing people to Jesus and accurately showing them what Jesus is like, who God is. That's what our purpose and meaning should be, according to what Peter is talking about here. Now, we're going to go ahead and read 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 10 as we continue on. So go ahead and pause this video as the screen comes up, read the passage, and then I want you to go ahead and answer those questions, and we'll come back together. Okay, so here Peter talks about the identity of the church. He says the church is a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of God's own possession. And it's important to understand that these terms are terms that the Old Testament uses to describe the people of Israel. So there is a transition here that Peter is trying to get at. See, Israel was considered God's chosen people. Now, all of us as a church have been bought and are God's chosen people. You are chosen as God's people. You are set apart. You are able to commune with God through Jesus. This then is Peter's way of making it clear that believers in Jesus are God's people. They belong to God. Why did God make us his people? What's the purpose? What are we called to accomplish? Well, God made us a people so that we could be able to tell of his greatness. That was the whole point. You have a purpose, and that purpose is to proclaim or even tell people about who God is and what he has done for you and how they can do the same. All of us have a story. We all have a story that we have to tell of how Jesus has impacted our life. And our story is that we have been rescued from darkness and brought into God's light. There's a story that comes with that. There's a story to tell. Now, I know we aren't meeting this week, but as you are at home, maybe you feel comfortable sharing your story with your family or somebody that you're very close with. You'd be able to tell them, hey, this is who Jesus is in my life, and this is how he has impacted my life. So the question is, how does that story go for you? Maybe something that you could do this week. You tell somebody that you know or even you don't know about your story of who Jesus is in your life. That might be a hard challenge for some of you, but it's also a challenge that'll help you be able to express and proclaim who Jesus is to someone else. What better way to share about who Jesus is with somebody else than through your story? So let's go ahead and read here, pause the video, read verses 11 through 12, answer these questions, and we'll come back together. So here, Peter is encouraging the church here in verse 11. He tells them to abstain from the passions of the flesh. In other words, he's telling them to no longer be ruled by our sinful desires. Now, verse 12 brings this idea back into light, and it talks about how believers should relate to unbelievers. It says that we are to live honorable lives. Even if unbelievers do stupid things to us as believers, even if they gossip about us, even if they harm us in any fashion whatsoever, we are called to live above that. We are called to live apart from our own desires and wantings. See, our core want and desire is to be selfish. As humanity, we are selfish human beings. That's just the way we are. But Peter is telling these churches to go above and beyond that, and to, instead of live for yourself, live for God, who then calls you to live for others. Live apart from yourself. Don't give in to what you want to do, because what you want to do ultimately without God is to sin. That's what we're all naturally desiring of. We all naturally want to do our own thing. We all naturally want to be about ourselves. But if we live apart from that, if we live apart from ourselves and be about others and be about God first, all of a sudden things change. See, the goal of honorably living among those that don't believe in Jesus, our hope for what happens is this: they will see what we do and give God glory because of it. The goal is that they will come to know Jesus. Well, the way we live affects the way that other people view who Jesus is. Peter is encouraging the church to demonstrate the love of Christ to people, especially people who are hostile towards them, which that's happening considering they're going through persecution, right? The big idea of this entire passage is that God has assembled a people who are there to proclaim the story of Jesus and to demonstrate the love of Jesus to people who are far from him. Why? Well, so we can point people to Jesus. So they would see and hear an accurate description of Jesus and choose to follow him themselves. Now, I want to go back to that compass we talked about at the beginning of this lesson. See, when a compass is broken, it still points in a direction. It's just not the right direction. The same is true for us. When we are not operating the way that God has called us to operate, we are still pointing people in a direction, just not towards Jesus. And I challenge you this week, focus your attention on pointing people towards Jesus and not away from him. Maybe you can use your story to help point people to who Jesus is, who God is. Other ways you can point people to Jesus is using your life as an example to follow. What you say and what you do reflect who God is in your life. And by living your life the way that God is asking you to live it, it helps point people in the direction of Christ instead of away from it. Let's go ahead and pray. God, we thank you for this morning. I know that we were not able to meet together as a student ministry, as a church, but I pray that you will just be with these students this morning, that you will continue to encourage them and help them be lights in where they're at. Help them live for you and help them enjoy the next 3 weeks as they are in between Thanksgiving break and Christmas break. Just give them strength to continue on during this COVID season and just during everything else. Help them continue to strive for you. In your name, we pray. Amen. All right, so this coming Wednesday, December 2nd, keep an eye on what is happening. I will go ahead and inform you of what's going on, but most likely we will be able to be back here at the branch. We will meet up, and next Sunday we will be back together as well. So keep an eye on some announcements. I will have other announcements for you, like some things that are going on here in December. Other than that, I hope you had an amazing Thanksgiving, a great time with your family, and I can't wait to see you guys again here soon. So have a good day.